As Liz mentioned, this is the first part in a 4-part series on EQuIS for ArcGIS that we're doing for office hours. And today I'm going to focus on just plot and symbolize locations, and I'll talk about some other location related things as well. And so as Liz introduced me already, I'm Emily Mulford. I'm the Corporate Programs and Training Director here at EarthSoft. And one caveat I would just like to make before I dive on in here is that I am by no stretch of the imagination an ArcGIS expert. And so for those of you guys that have a strong ArcGIS background, you guys will be like, man, she's really kind of terrible in there. But the nice thing about understanding the EQuIS for ArcGIS interface is it's really just a very small part of ArcMap, and once you know how to pull your stuff out of EQuIS and put it on the map, then you can really leverage ArcGIS for its full capabilities as well. So just bear with me a little bit, and if there are questions you guys have specifically at the end about ArcMap or something like that that I can't answer, I can definitely take note of those and find the answers to those for you guys as well. Okay. So let me start my slides here. Here we go. So as I mentioned, this is the first part in a 4-part series, and today we're just going to focus on the plot and symbolize locations. And then we'll do this over the next 4 weeks, including this week. So next Thursday is going to be the build and animate analytical results. The following Thursday, June 8th, I think, is the create spider diagrams. And then Thursday after that is going to be the add and label pie charts and maps. So you can sign up for any or all of those that you're interested in. And so really what we're going to focus on today is just kind of the most basic stuff. We're going to talk a little bit about the requirements in terms of getting your data out of EQuIS and putting it into ArcMap. And I'll show you guys how to get our locations up there and some of the functionality associated with that. And so the first thing I really want to do is just talk a little bit in these slides about reviewing the EQuIS for ArcGIS requirements. Then we will actually do a bit of a demo where I'll connect EQuIS and ArcGIS and plot some locations and add a base map and all kinds of good stuff. Then we'll talk a little bit about the EarthSoft styles and how you can change default symbology pretty easily within ArcMap. And then at the very end, we'll talk a little bit more about locations and location groups and how you can actually add those via ArcGIS. So to talk a bit about the requirements, I kind of broke this down into several, I guess, subcategories just to make things a little bit easier here for us. So in terms of what you need installed on your workstation, you need EQuIS Professional version 6 or higher. You need ArcGIS version 10.0 or higher, and then you probably also are going to want .NET Framework 4.0 or higher. And so just to give you guys some context, the demo that I'm going to show you guys today is with EQuIS Professional 6.6.0, ArcMap 10.4, but it also works fine in 10.0 all the way up through 10.5. And then I have .NET 4.5.1, I think, on my machine. Okay. The only other tip or thing I want to mention about in terms of software is I recommend installing, if you don't have any of these things installed on your machine and you're going to put all of them on there, install ArcGIS first before EQuIS Professional. It's much easier that way, I promise. If you do wind up installing EQuIS Professional first and then you put ArcMap on your machine, you're going to want to probably actually uninstall EQuIS Professional and reinstall it, because installing EQuIS Professional, it automatically looks to see if ArcGIS is installed. Anyway, so I recommend ArcGIS first if possible, then EQuIS Professional, save you a little heartache. Okay. In terms of licensing requirements, the ArcGIS, or the EQuIS for ArcGIS interface, I should say, works with the Premier Graphics, Premier Data and Graphics, or the Ultimate License library. So if you have one license available in any of those 3 libraries, you can use those to connect EQuIS and ArcGIS. And then in terms of permissions, the permissions are actually fairly flexible for most of what you're doing in terms of pulling your EQuIS data out of ArcMap and putting it, or your EQuIS data into ArcMap, most of that is pretty equivalent to running a report. So the same permissions you have to run reports will work for most of the things that you're trying to do within ArcGIS when it comes to your EQuIS data at the very least. So really that just means read or viewer permissions for being able to add layers and connect to EQuIS and all that sort of stuff. In order to do the last couple of things that I'm going to show you guys today, which is adding and modifying locations and also creating and editing location groups in ArcMap, you do need to have read-write permissions or editor permissions in order to do those things, because you're actually saving that stuff back to the EQuIS database. Okay, so just keep that in mind. I think I have admin permissions to everything in mind, so I can do all this stuff, but just keep that in the back of your mind if you're trying to do one of these things after the fact. And then there are a few requirements in terms of what fields you need populated in EQuIS for this to really work well for us. And at a bare minimum, you want to have some location data in EQuIS. First of all, you're not going to be able to plot much of anything if you have, samples and tests and results, but you don't have any locations related to those, then you're not going to be super successful putting that stuff on a map. So we want to make sure we have a couple of fields in DT facility populated, specifically cord type code and identifier. We want to make sure we have, at very least for each location, each one needs to be in DT location and have a sysloc code, which is EQuIS speak for your location ID, populated. So you want sysloc code populated. And then in DT coordinate, you're going to need sysloc code in DT coordinate, and then also that cord type code and identifier field. So that screenshot that I have there is sysloc code, cord type code, and identifier from DT coordinate. And you guys see that those are all part of the primary key. And then of course you ultimately need to have your coordinates as well. Those are not actually technically required fields. But of course you want to have those for the coordinate system that you're using. Okay. The other data type requirement that I want to mention here is that you really want to have, if you're talking about your cord type code, that's basically your coordinate system, your coordinate type. That's actually coming from a reference table called RT cord type. And in addition to having that record in general in that reference table with the cord type code field populated, the other thing that'll really save you a lot of effort in ArcGIS is if you populate this ESRI spatial ref field, and you can see there I populated it for my data set with this big long string. So this is different than your SRID or your WKID that you might use for map widgets and things like that. For ArcGIS desktop applications and your EQuIS data, you want to populate this ESRI spatial reference with your entire long spatial reference. That way your EQuIS data will automatically come out in that correct projection, and you won't have to set that after the fact in ArcGIS or anything like that. Okay, so not a complete requirement, but kind of a strong recommendation, I'll say. Okay, so we're going to connect to EQuIS and plot locations, and you can really do this in a couple of different ways when you're doing using the EQuIS for ArcGIS interface. You can ultimately log into EQuIS Professional and then go to the GIS ribbon, and there's an ArcMap button right in there. You can click that ArcMap button, and then it'll basically launch ArcMap. And then you can do all of these sort of steps. And if you want to do that and you want to connect via EQuIS Professional, that's totally fine. However, I generally prefer to have as few applications open on my screen as possible at any one time for whatever I'm trying to do. So the other thing that you can actually do is simply just launch ArcMap from, assuming you have it installed, you can just launch it from your start menu, or if you have a shortcut for it or whatever. So you can launch it, you'll start all programs, ArcGIS, ArcMap 10, whatever version is. And then if you have the EQuIS for ArcGIS interface, then what you'll see in there, assuming it's turned on and everything, is the EQuIS for ArcGIS toolbar. And so the whole interface essentially sits on this little toolbar that we'll see in there. And all we need to do is add facility and essentially log into our EQuIS facility within ArcMap. So I'm going to show you guys how to do that here in just a moment. Okay. So what I want to do now is just a bit of a demonstration for you guys here. I'm going to connect. I have a little bit of smoke and mirrors just to save us a little bit of time, simply because it can take some time to connect to EQuIS and pull out the locations, and launching ArcMap can take a little bit of time. So I've already done a couple of these pieces, but I'll show you guys all of the steps and then just kind of skip forward a little bit. So we're going to connect to an EQuIS facility with the EQuIS for ArcGIS toolbar in ArcMap. You'll see that our locations essentially plot automatically when we do that. And then we're going to go through and add a base map, label some locations, talk about changing the default symbology. And then if you make changes, then you want to recreate the sample location layer so you can actually see those changes. So we're going to do that as well here. So let me stop sharing my webcam here for a few minutes, and then I'll turn it back on when we're doing questions, so that you guys can see this full screen. And let me just switch over to ArcGIS. Okay. So I do already have ArcMap launched, and I did actually already connect to my EQuIS facility once. So you can just kind of ignore this for now. When you come in here and you just load a blank map for the first time, it essentially looks like what we have on my screen here. And the EQuIS for ArcGIS toolbar is this toolbar that I have, and you can, just like any other toolbar in ArcGIS, you can float this or dock it or whatever you want to do. If you don't see this toolbar and you think, well, I have EQuIS Professional and ArcGIS installed, you know, everything should be there, just take a look, just like you would for any other toolbar. Take a look at your customized toolbars, and then EQuIS for ArcGIS. Make sure that this is turned on, because it may not get turned on automatically by default. So make sure you have this and that it's turned on. And if you are expecting to see it and you don't, you can't find it, you know, just let us know on our help desk, and we can help you track it down. Okay. But when you want to connect to EQuIS from within ArcMap, you can just come to this toolbar, you select your EQuIS dropdown, and there's actually a ton of stuff on this EQuIS dropdown. This is where most of our things are sitting within the EQuIS for ArcGIS interfaces on this dropdown. And if I want to log into my facility to plot some locations, I simply go to Add Facility. And this probably looks fairly familiar to those of you guys that are used to EQuIS Professional. And this is essentially the EQuIS login screen. The only thing that is different about this is we have, as opposed to EQuIS Professional, is we have this ribbon across the top of the EQuIS login screen. And there's several buttons up here. And as you guys can see from me hovering over this first button that says Use Existing, each of these buttons has a fairly extensive tooltip that you can take a look at and read through to figure out kind of what these different options do. The long and the short of it is that you can, when you connect to your EQuIS facility, by default, all of your data that you're pulling out of EQuIS gets stored in a cache in a file geodatabase on your machine. So with these buttons, these sample location layer buttons, you can determine if you want to pull data simply from that file geodatabase cache, or whether you want to pull data fresh out of EQuIS and things like that. So there's a few different options up here. I connected using the very most basic options. I said use existing, and I chose not to open tables or create relates or anything like that. You can do that. You don't need to do that in order to add other layers and run reports and things like that. So unless you absolutely need to pull in the raw data tables into ArcMap from EQuIS, I usually don't do that, just because it can take a lot of processing power to get that over in here. Okay. So if I was going to do this again, I would simply, log into the database where I wanted to go and find my desired facility. And so if I wanted to get into this facility here called Gold King Mine, I could do that. And then I just want to select one of these three, license levels that are appropriate to doing things in ArcGIS. And then I would just double click just like you normally do when you're logging into EQuIS Professional. I've already done this part of it just because when you do pull this out of EQuIS the first time, it can take a little bit of time. So I'm just going to close this, pretend that I selected it. And what it'll give us when it's done plotting all of this information is it'll give us this layer here, and this is called our sample locations layer. And it'll plot a variety of symbols on a map here for us. And you guys are probably squinting at your screens right now in order to try and see those little blue raindrops that are on my screen, but I'll make that a little bit easier here for us in just a second. But it basically takes all of that data out of EQuIS. It takes my location data in the coordinate system that I defined, and it puts it in that projection. So all of that is in here and ready to go for me. Okay, so it plotted these locations for me automatically. If I want to add a base map, I can do that, or you can of course add any kind of shape files or anything else that you want. So just for our purposes today, I'll add a base map to give us a little something else to look at on my screen here. And I'm just going to go to File, Add Data, and I'm just going to do Add Base Map. And there's like 18 different ways to do most of this stuff, but a lot of times I go the long way. So there's several different base maps that ArcMap and ArcGIS kind of offer up to us. I think there's 12 different options here. If we want to use one of these instead of one of our own, we can grab these. So I'll just choose, I guess, imagery with labels. That has a nice dark background here. So because my ESRI spatial reference field was already populated in the chord type table, there's no issue trying to put a map along with my EQuIS, base map along with my EQuIS locations on here, because it already recognizes that projection and can put the map in that appropriate projection. Hopefully you guys can see this sort of okay on my map here, and you see that these surface water locations, these are surface water locations, these little raindrops that I have on my screen are ultimately following along a river. And so this is for the Gold King mine spill that happened a couple of years ago, and they follow along the San Juan River, all these different sampling points, just to give you a little context here, okay? So for those of you guys that have used ArcGIS before, you're probably familiar with the concept of being able to label all of your features for a given layer within ArcMap. You could just go over to the table of contents. So if I wanted to label all of my locations, I could come over to the table of contents, right-click on my layer, and then do label features. Okay, and that would label all of my surface water sampling points within this layer. Okay. However, with EQuIS for ArcGIS, one of the cool things you can do is actually select which features within a layer you want to label. So if I have my Select Features tool on and I just draw a box or, you know, polygon or whatever I want to do around several features, maybe I just am interested in labeling these locations that we have here, I can do that, and then I simply right-click anywhere in here, and I come down to where it says Label. Okay, so I did a right-click in the map, and then I just come down to where it says Label. And then only those locations are labeled, and this is pulling my syslop code out of here if you're ever wondering what it's showing me right here. This is my syslop codes that are coming from my EQuIS data, ultimately from the attribute table that's part of this layer now. Okay, so pretty quick and easy to label locations. Okay, or other features on the map, and you get one of the things you guys will see in one of the next series is, or I think in part 4 of the series is labeling pie charts and things like that as well, but it's the same concept. Okay. The other thing that I want to show you guys in here before we flip back to the slides is I want to talk a little bit about the default symbology. You guys see that I have some raindrops in here that are this weird pale blue color. Maybe I'm not crazy about that. I have these labels that you can perhaps see on my screen, and they're showing up as yellow. If I want to change any of this symbology, I can always come to the table of contents, you know, double click or right click and select properties and do things that way, and that's perfectly fine. If I did want to do something that way, you know, change my labels for this layer or change my symbology, if I didn't, you know, if I wanted to tweak this a little bit or change it to a different symbol altogether, I could do that. Okay, that's totally fine. However, this default symbology is coming from somewhere, and that somewhere is actually a style file that gets installed when you install EQuIS Professional, if ArcGIS is on there as well. And that style file is called the EarthSoft style file. And you can get to any of the style files, let's see how many times I say that, the same exact way that you would get to your other style files using the style manager. But you can also get to it from this EQuIS drop-down menu here. So if I click the EQuIS drop-down menu, one of the things I can do is come down towards the very bottom of this drop-down where it says Options. And there's about 8 zillion options on here. Kind of the take-home message of the options screen is if there's a default option that's related to EQuIS for ArcGIS that you think you might want to change, you can probably come in here and find that option and make changes to it. Each of these things, again, has a nice long tooltip associated with it when you hover over it, so it tells you what it'll do. But if we're looking for the EarthSoft style file, we're just going to come to the Map tab, and then I'm going to go to EarthSoft Styles. And so in here we have our ESRI style files, and there's multiple ones and things like that. And what we want to do is take a look at our EarthSoft style file. And so if I expand this, okay, you can see the yellow folders indicate that there's something in those folders. I could set up other styles if I want to for various things as well. If we want to take a look at those yellow labels that I used, my screen's covering them right now, but if we want to take a look at those yellow labels that I used to label my locations, and if I said, I don't like yellow, or I want to make them bigger, or I want to make them pink or something like that, I can come to Labels. And so there's different labels for different things that we can do within EQuIS for ArcGIS, and you guys will see some more examples of these in the next couple of sessions. But this just plain label here, this is what it uses for the sample location layer. And you see, barely can see there that it's yellow. So if I wanted to instead make this, pink or something else, I could double click on it, do symbol properties, and then I could change this to whatever I wanted. So I could change it to different font over here. I could simply change the color in the font and make it, bigger or whatever I wanted to do in here, and then simply do, cancel. I would actually hit edit symbol, I believe. Yeah, and then change it here, and then hit OK. My screen's just not showing it here. Let me move this, sorry. Okay, so then I would just hit OK and OK, and then it would change the label here. This means that the next time I try to label locations, it'll automatically use my new label that's in the EarthSoft style file instead of trying to change each one by hand, once I create those labels and those layers. So this is for our default symbology. Under marker symbols, okay, if I click on marker symbols, this is where, if you guys can see this on my screen here, this is where the surf water sampling symbol is. And so these are based on, by default, loc type. You can change that if you want to something else. So you see where it says surf water sampling and it says default. So if I wanted to change this to something else, dark blue or something with a better outline or a different symbol altogether, same kind of thing, double click on it, and I could make those whatever desired changes I wanted to make. The other thing that I can do in here, though, is if I wanted to maybe use specific symbols for the facility I'm in, Gold King Mine, but then I wanted to use different symbols for other facilities, you can actually make multiples of these and simply change the categories. So instead of setting this as default, you would set this to, for example, Gold King Mine. So I could even copy this, say I want to use the light blue for everything except Gold King Mine, but then when it's Gold King Mine, do a copy and a paste, and you just change the name. Okay, you want this to match your loc type, whatever loc type you're using within DT location, but then you change your category to the facility code instead of just a default. And so if I wanted to set this just for Gold King Mine, but I want my raindrops to be, I don't know, dark blue or something instead. Okay, whoops, I changed the wrong thing. I always do that. Okay, have to select the raindrop. That's part of the part of the tricky part here. But if I wanted these to be dark blue or something along those lines instead, I could do that. And so for Gold King Mine, there'll be these dark blue raindrops. For everything else, they'll now be light blue. And you can have as many of those different categories as you want. So each category can be facility-specific symbols. Okay. So once I've made some changes to my labels and my water droplets here, I can close this. I can hit OK on here so I don't have to save or anything like that. I've already pretty much done all of that. And you see that my symbols here are still exactly the same. So if I could close out of this and reopen it and recreate it and do all that sort of stuff, and that would be perfectly fine if I really wanted to do that. Or I could just come down to my EQuIS dropdown, come down to Utilities, and then under Utilities I could do Recreate Sample Location Layer. Okay, so if I click this, then it'll redraw my sample location layer, but just with the fixed up symbology. So you see my raindrops now are dark blue instead of light blue. And if I wanted to label some things, I'll just label a couple this time. Right click, label, and so now I have these big pink labels instead of those yellow ones you guys were seeing earlier. Okay. And Liz has been good enough, I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but as I've been talking, Liz has been good enough to put some tips in our chat box as well in terms of checking to make sure how to turn on the EQuIS for ArcGIS toolbar, where the style file is located by default, and things like that, and we'll send you guys that information afterwards as well. Okay. Okay, so let me go back to my slides for a moment or two here. So in terms of what I just showed you guys, we just went through, we connected to our Gold King Mine facility with EQuIS for ArcGIS toolbar. We plotted locations pretty much automatically when we did that. We added a base map, we labeled locations, we changed some default symbology, and then we recreated the sample location layer. Okay. The last two things that I want to talk about here are locations and location groups in ArcMap. You have the ability within ArcMap to both digitize locations. So if you're looking at the map, for example, and you know there's a new location that needs to get added to EQuIS somewhere, you can actually digitize that directly from within ArcMap. And I'll show you how to do that. It's just with this on this Utilities menu, if you guys can see in my screenshot here. Under the EQuIS dropdown, Utilities, there's an option to add and edit locations. So I can show you how to do that. And then the other thing we can do that's really cool is we can, a lot of you are probably used to setting up location groups within EQuIS Professional. You can also set up location groups within ArcGIS. And I really like this feature because you can select several locations visually on the map and say, I want to make a location group of these selected locations and do it actually very quickly and easily. Okay. So a couple of other additional things that we can do in here. So let me go flip back to ArcMap just for a second and I'll show you these two items. Okay. So if I wanted to digitize a location, let's say I wanted to add one, let me get my mouse back here. Let's say I wanted to add one, I don't know if you guys can see my little tiny white mouse, but if I wanted to add one somewhere along the river here, I could go to EQuIS, Utilities, and then add edit locations. You can also edit existing locations, so if you find that one of those maybe doesn't have the coordinates you expected it to have, you can edit it. You do need write permissions in order to save this back to EQuIS. But if I do add edit locations, you can choose what kind of location you want to add, so you can come to locations by location type, and let's say I wanted to add another surface water sampling point. Okay, I would highlight that, and then there's this little tiny white piece of paper here that says add location. I would click that white piece of paper. I would give this a new syslot code, so if this is, I don't know, EM01 or something like that, you could do that. You could also give it a location name, okay, and then you hit OK, and that gives you, and this form that we're looking at, this window that we're looking at, is exactly the same as the location form within EQuIS Professional, for those of you guys that are familiar with that. And so this gives me my location information. up at the top, and I can fill in any of this other information that I want. But if I wanted to then digitize the coordinates instead of putting these in by hand, I could absolutely do that. And I would just come to the top left-hand corner where the digitize tool is, okay, right next to a little white piece of paper. Click on the digitize tool. That's going to give me, it's hard to see on my base map here, that's going to give me this little, if you guys can see that a little bit better, this crosshair. And then if I'm trying to digitize a location, I just simply select it. Okay, so I selected it on the map, my form automatically pops back up, and it gives me the chord type code, the identifier, and then the X and Y coordinates based on that projection and everything. So this is another reason why it's really handy to set that projection ahead of time within that ESRI spatial reference field. So then once I've digitized this, I could make tweaks to it. Maybe my click wasn't exactly right, but I was off by a couple of numbers or something. I could certainly edit this. When I'm all done, I select Save. And it asks me if I'm sure, and as long as I have right permissions, then this will save back to EQuIS Professional for me, back to the EQuIS database, I should say. So I can save that. I'm done. The location doesn't show up in here automatically. Do not panic when that happens, okay? All you need to do is simply, you can't actually recreate the sample location layer. You do have to basically go in and kind of pull out that new location. So it would require, usually the easiest thing I found is just closing ArcMap at some point, reopening it, pulling out, doing the EQuIS add facility again, and then you'll see your new location on there, because it's not going to be stored in your file geodatabase cache. Okay, so you can add new locations pretty quick and easy. And then the other thing we can do is we can add or edit existing location groups. So let's say I wanted to make a location group with, I don't know, these few locations that I have along the river here. Okay, and I wanted to call this my, I don't know, middle river group or something like that. I could simply select those locations, then come to the EQuIS dropdown, Utilities, and then Create Edit Location Group. And I don't know why it's so far off my screen, so let me pull it over here for us. Okay, and it automatically gives me a fairly terrible name for these, so I can rename this to something much more useful than Location 1. But if I look at the Group Members tab, here are all of the locations already part of this group, and they're part of this group because I selected them on my map. So instead of having to, label those or remember what those syslope codes are and then come in here and add them by hand, you can just select the locations you want as part of your group, create location group using that utilities menu, and then you're on your way. And you can always add additional ones to that if maybe you couldn't select everything or you left one off or something like that. And this group shows up everywhere. Once it's saved back to EQuIS, it shows up in EQuIS Professional, shows up as something you can use for SPM, shows up as a group you can use in reporting and enterprise. Okay, so it's a nice kind of quick and easy way to create location groups visually from the map. Okay, I'm not going to necessarily save this one, but just to give you guys an idea of how that works here. Okay, so in terms of, so that's really what I wanted to show you guys, is kind of some additional stuff with regards to locations and location groups. And that's more or less it. I wanted to reiterate, this is really just sort of the tip of the iceberg with the stuff you can do with EQuIS for ArcGIS. So next week, we're going to do a build and animate analytical results session. June 8th, we're going to do create spider diagrams. And then June 15th, we're going to do add and label pie charts and maps. So those should all be a lot of fun. And definitely come back for any of those that you want to come back for. And we'll, of course, record them and everything as well. But what I thought I'd do now is turn my webcam back on here and stop talking at the speed of light and see what questions there are. Yeah, there we go. Oh, Liz, I think you're muted still.
Oh, thank you. It's good you could see my mouth moving.
Yeah, I know.
So thank you so much. We do have a couple of questions. The first one's from Beatrice, and she asks, if you change something in your map, will it automatically be changed in the database in EQuIS?
That's a good question, and the short answer is it really depends on what you're changing. The main things are going to be what I just showed at the very end there, where when you're digitizing locations, those get saved back to EQuIS, or if you're doing the create edit location groups, those will get saved back to EQuIS. For the most part, if you're making a change, say in the attribute table or somewhere else, really just within ArcGIS itself, those things aren't going to get saved back to the database. Those are going to be really just saved just in the map itself instead of back to EQuIS somewhere. Good question. Any others?
Yes, it looks like there is a question from Kathleen. She
Okay.
said, any tips on the initial connection when there's a high volume of locations in VW location for the facility that you're working in?
Yeah, that's a good question too, Kathleen. My number one tip, probably, let me actually go back to ArcGIS here. My number one tip comes probably from with the add facility tool here. So if I go to EQuIS add facility, I briefly mentioned this ribbon that we have up at the top. If I have a ton of locations that I'm connecting to, or that I'm trying to pull out onto a map or something like that, I will, the very first time I connect, I can just do, it doesn't really matter if I do use existing or overwrite locations or something like that, because the very first time it's pulling those out of EQuIS one way or the other. But going forward, assuming there aren't a lot of changes to those locations, or ideally no changes to those locations, they're more or less static, then I would, if you have a lot of locations, I would recommend this use existing selection, simply because this will go into the cache instead of trying to pull all of that information out of EQuIS again. So it's just faster. The other thing that I would recommend is the open tables, leaving this unchecked. This will speed things up quite a bit as well. Again, if you're just trying to create like report layers and you're not needing to do a bunch of stuff with the raw data itself out here and attribute tables and things like that, just leave that open tables unchecked. The other thing that I'll pull it up here while I'm talking. The other thing that I would recommend is within EQuIS Professional. Let me close this so I don't have two of them up. Within EQuIS Professional, you can really use that identifier field kind of to leverage if you only want subsets of locations for a facility in your map at any given time. ArcMap, unlike the map widget, which is a little bit more flexible within Enterprise, ArcMap is really just looking at sort of all of your locations that have a specific chord type code and a specific identifier. So you can use the identifier field sort of as a way of controlling which locations wind up on the map. So if instead of, if you have hopefully not 20,000 locations, but you very well might, for a facility, have 20,000 locations and you only want to see certain ones on the map. One of the things you could do is go into your reference tables and go into, not your reference tables, sorry, your data tables, go into DT coordinate, and my camera's right in the way here, so let me move it. You could go into DT coordinate. And then the identifier field here. So right now, all of my locations is set to primary, and this is going to ensure that all of these things, they all have the same identifier, so they're all going to wind up on the map together. If I instead only wanted to see certain things on the map in ArcMap, I could actually use different identifiers and then simply say, you can actually use this little toolbar down at the bottom here to say, right now, I only want to see things with my Northwest identifier or something like that, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't matter what you call your identifier as long as they're all the same. And then you say, I want to see things only for my primary identifier, only for my Northwest identifier, only for my historical identifier. And ArcMap will by default only choose those things. And it doesn't matter if they're in the same coordinate system or not. If they have different identifiers, it'll only map what you want. So that's a little bit more of a manual process. That's if you really only want a certain subset of locations on your map. That's not a bad way to deal with that, assuming that's not changing a lot or anything. But just in terms of speed, go with the use existing button and avoid the open tables and create relates and stuff if you can. And those should help quite a bit, I in my experience. Yeah, so that was a super long answer. And I also saw another question. I might be skipping ahead a little bit, Liz, but I just saw a question out of the corner of my eye about DT sub-facility, if this works with DC. If you can basically plot based on DT sub-facility. The short answer is no, at least not within ArcMap. The map widget has some more flexibility in Enterprise where you can plot only like specific location groups. But ArcMap is the way the interface is set up is it's only looking for essentially using chord type code and identifier. So you could set your identifier to be the same as your sub-facility if you wanted. And then you're only plotting one sub-facility at a time, but that would really be the only way to do that piece of it. Okay, so I'm done. I'm ready for the next one if there are any more.
Excellent. Well, Kathleen did note that they need to be careful on using the identifier for creating subsections of locations if multiple teammates are working on that same facility at the same time.
Absolutely. And that's a very great point. That's an excellent note that if you are changing something in here, you're changing the identifier down here for facility, you're changing it not just on your machine, you're changing it for that facility. Now, somebody else can always change it back potentially, and it's not quite as scary as it sounds, but you are ultimately changing the identifier for the entire facility because it essentially is changing it in the DT facility table as opposed to just on your local machine or something. So yeah, that's a great point. You do want to be aware of that, be careful.
Excellent.
Cool. Any others?
Oh, we've got a feature request to get ArcMap to work with sub-facility. So
yeah, that's a great one. We'll write that up. I figured that was coming. So that's a good one, Kathleen. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Cool. We can write that up. And we'll send you guys the link for that so you can vote for that because I'm guessing other people will be interested in that one as well.
Most definitely. All right. I don't see any questions. Let me double check and see if there are any hands up. So if you have any questions, future topic suggestions, or would like to sign up for future office hours, please email us at officehours@earthsoft.com. And thanks again, Emily, and thank you everyone for attending. We hope to see you next week.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Liz.